Well, speaking of values, two councillors really impressed me at the Sustainable Living Festival. Actually, I must say it was one of the highlights for me. Yep. When we had Susan Rennie and Trent McCarthy, who are councillors in Darebin City Council, and they were talking about how it has come about that Darebin now, as the first place, as far as we know, in the world, has what they call a climate emergency plan. So that it's not just that they have declared, oh, we have an emergency. No, they have a plan for what to do. This is really interesting, and we learned how it all came about in a very personal way, because the MC of that event was Adrian Whitehead. He runs an organization together with some other people called Community Action for the Climate Emergency. He was the co-founder of Beyond Zero Emissions, which is a group that many people have heard about. I think he's also been very much involved with what's going on in Darebin City Council, and in the beginning, Trent McCarthy explained how it all began with a conversation that Adrian and Trent had in a car park as they were standing just discussing something that they were going to do in the council.
It was actually a conversation that Adrian and I had in a car park where I was writing a motion for the first council meeting saying we're going to set up an energy foundation at Darebin, which is now going to be called the Climate Emergency. It's going to be called Climate Emergency Darebin, incidentally. And it was actually that Adrian said, make sure you mention the climate emergency in the motion. And I thought, okay, no worries, we'll do that. And we went around and all the councillors talked about it. And I didn't realise what a big impact that would have. And I remember posting it on Facebook, and it had 10,000 views within 2 days. It went silly. And it was actually that it was a breakthrough moment for people to hear that. But I wouldn't have put those words in that declaration. I wouldn't have included that declaration had Adrian not said to me, make sure you use those words, because people committed to it. You can go there. And it's actually the emboldening of the community to say, keep going. You know, you've gotten elected or re-elected, but now you've got to implement the strongest possible policy, which is what climate emergency is as a policy setting. And all the stuff we've done since then, I don't think we would have been able to do had we not included that framework, which now is actually in the CEO's performance plan. It's part of our organisational structure, and 1,300 staff have to be educated about it over the next couple of years. So it flows on through the organisation very quickly.
Just on that, there's some key steps that a council has to do. You included a climate emergency reference in your strategic plan. Why is that important for the community to understand? Susan, would you like to answer that? Yep.
It's very easy for councillors to pass motions in the chamber, and equally easy for those motions not to go very far. And it struck us that we needed to follow up ourselves and be true to what we'd said we would do. And you can't say it's an emergency and then not actually act. And that meant that we developed a climate emergency plan, and I've brought a summary in here, which actually outlined how we were going to address this emergency, the actions we would take, and what it meant. And I think that's actually where the real power lies in many ways for me, because it's very easy to say things and not follow through. And within a council environment, having a policy and having clear actions and targets next to that policy is really critical for making sure that it happens.
And that also relates to staff performance and CEO performance. If it's not in the strategic plan, is the CEO actually obliged to act on it in any way?
Yeah, so this is a really important point. If you can get your council to include a reference to responding to the climate emergency in its municipal health and wellbeing plan, which is about people's welfare and their safety, or you can get it into the council plan or any plan at all, the CEO and the management team have to respond to that. And they're supposed to be held accountable by the councillors, who are then held accountable by the community. But they also need to report on it on either a quarterly, half-yearly or an annual basis. In our case, because we got that climate emergency piece in at the very first meeting, the very first motion of the new term, it meant that it was in the council plan, it's in the CEO's plan. We recently have gone through an organisational restructure, and the message to all staff throughout the whole organisation is we need an organisation that can respond to the climate emergency. It's the opening line that went to 1,300 staff about changing how we do things. We're the first council, I think, in the world to take that path, but it means that now council staff, people are applying for jobs at Darebin because they want to work in a climate emergency responding organisation. So we're attracting people to the organisation, much to the horror of other councils. So I think that you start to get momentum, and people own it, and the staff own it, And the next thing is really obviously things like climate emergency training that we need to start doing in the organisation as well.
Now, just on the issue of momentum, I mean, we have the climate emergency plan that you guys held up earlier. Just to note that as we entered this process, an existing draft of the climate plan had almost been finished. So what part of the process was we literally had to go through a redrafting exercise, didn't we? Would any of you like to comment on that? Maybe.
Yep. Yep. So Darebin's had a really strong positioning on climate for a long time. We had one of the first council commitments to zero emissions back in 2009, like most of the inner Melbourne councils did. At the time, the council staff actually wanted to have a 50% reduction in emissions, and thankfully at the council level we said, no, we need to be talking about zero emissions. So going back almost a decade now, we've had that positioning. Where things had gotten to, though, is that a lot of councils had started to adopt what's called the carbon budget concept, which is, I think, is now, and I would have, had I not heard from these guys, I probably would have accepted the advice from officers that we need to talk about quantifiable components. The problem with the whole concept of carbon budget is that it basically says only do what you need to do as your share of emissions of the total global emissions. It sounds nice, but it actually means that there's no ambition, there's no innovation. And so the big piece that we've had over the last few years is the Solar Savers program, which basically has put solar on people's roofs with no upfront costs. Had we not adopted a climate emergency position, we'd be putting maybe 500 installations. We've just committed last year, and then we're now rolling it out to 4,000 buildings across Darebin, which is the largest rollout of solar of any local government area in the country. And that's because of the policy position that forces that type of action, and basically means that we have to do those sorts of things in order to respond to the climate emergency. So it enables boldness, and it enables a type of investment by the council that otherwise simply wouldn't be there.
Susan?
Just to add, I think one of the reasons that we couldn't just take our existing climate plans and tinker with them a bit is that we weren't interested in a business-as-usual approach. We recognise that we need to do things differently, because business as usual is not going to get us where we need to be in terms of emissions reduction and then drawdown. And councils have a lot of plans, and business as usual often means that things move quite slowly within a government setting. There's processes that involve lengthy consultations, that involve a lot of drafting and redrafting of things. And those processes can mean that actions that seem quite simple can take 2 years. And if we're in emergency mode, then 2 years for simple actions is not okay. And we needed a new plan that really reflected that.
Yes, and we're developing that now at Darebin, aren't we? And part of that process has been, actually what I'm going to kick to now is, and highlighting the issue of solar savers. Now, we know that local government will not have the funds to implement a climate emergency response at the scale. So we need federal, we need state funding. So a very important part of the whole program is the upwards push to federal and state governments to get the dollars, to get the commitments, to get the change in policy, and sideways to other local governments to build a critical mass, as well as educating downwards. But, Susan, you leapt on that goal of the sideways push almost immediately, didn't you? Could you just tell us about that experience?
Yes, so all councils in Victoria are part of the Municipal Association of Victoria, and those councils nominate a delegate and gather twice a year at a forum called State Council, where councils can put up a lot of different motions, identifying things that they think are important to the local government sector and actions that they want to see the Municipal Association of Victoria take. So a couple of months after we passed our climate emergency motion, I put a motion up to the MAV, which was not dissimilar to our motion. It basically said that the MAV recognises that we're in a state of climate emergency and that local government has a pivotal role in responding to that. I wasn't sure what would happen with that motion at the MAV because, councils are a really mixed bag across Victoria, and there's some that are quite conservative. In fact, there's a lot more rural councils than there are metropolitan councils, so a lot of quite tiny councils exist in country areas. So even though the population is in Melbourne, the bulk of councils are outside of Melbourne. And it was really an opportunity to test that kind of language and that willingness to actually consider that this is an emergency with councils from all over Victoria. And I was pretty delighted when that motion passed. and it passed quite convincingly. It wasn't sort of 95%, but it was a really solid majority. 77%, thank you. And, that meant that there were a lot of councillors from a lot of councils that might have quite conservative leanings that could nevertheless get on board, that weren't scared off by that language, and that actually were willing to accept that climate emergency was an appropriate way of talking about this. And I'm not naive enough to think that that's going to immediately mean action by the Municipal Association of Victoria, because on that same day there were about 70 motions that got passed, and the MAV won't treat every one of those motions as an emergency. But it did say that there's a real willingness amongst local governments to think about this and talk about this as an emergency. And that means that if you're in one of those local government areas, you can go to your councillors and say, look, at the state level, this is accepted as something that we have to acknowledge and recognise and act. And I think it will really strengthen our ability to then work individually with different councils around Victoria.
Great, thank you. And that was fantastic. So we're thinking in that same sort of mode. We need to get the next council. And we've had Moreland and Yarra make an announcement around the climate emergency, but we actually haven't seen a sort of climate emergency roll out yet. So in Perth, Bryony's been going over to Perth a bit, going over to the Perth councils, and we met with Fremantle, various other councils, and Fremantle was very pissed off that Darebin had been beaten to it. They'd beaten again to a climate emergency initiative. So we should be seeing some things over in Perth quite soon. But we've got Yarra and Moreland here. Maybe some thoughts from either of you on what could people do as a next step, maybe?
Look, your councils, if you're in Yarra and Moreland, have also passed a climate emergency declaration. But then they didn't do anything. And if it's an emergency, then you do something. You don't stand and watch the house burn down. And so if you're in Yarra or Moreland, it's time to call up your councillors, send them an email and say, hey, have you seen what Darebin's doing? They've actually got a policy to back up their motion. They've actually got a process which they're looking at to really move rapidly towards responding. And I think that's very critical, because in some ways passing a climate emergency motion but then not treating it as an emergency actually takes the wind out of it. And it's quite possible, and I think there's councillors there who are quite willing, maybe they thought the climate emergency declaration was enough, and actually we need the action to follow up. And it's up to you as people who live in those municipalities to actually give those councillors a nudge and get them moving.
Trent?
There's a funny thing with local councillors, which is that they want to be loved because they get a lot of pain. And a lot of the pain they receive is actually not of their own making. So I would suggest that if you can make contact, even if you're not at Yarra or Moreland, even if it's another council, to talk to them about what making both a climate emergency declaration would do, but also then to carry that into a plan would actually do. There's three things that come to mind straight away, which they probably want to do, but they haven't realised how to do it. So because we have this framing of climate emergency, it means that we can use our council budget to basically have a mass rollout of solar on the roofs of the most vulnerable people, and have a mechanism for them to actually pay that back over time with no upfront costs. So we're helping out the poor people in our community, right? And so you talk about the human element here. People that literally will not turn on their air conditioners on a really hot day and get heat island effect and heat wave effect as a result. The other thing, though, which is really important, is that if they have been trying to do these sorts of programs, they also probably want to actually be in the space where they're engaging with others. So we've built a bit of a network of councillors that are active on the climate emergency. It's pretty likely that your local councillors aren't in that network. So get on board. That's another way to connect. Be part of something.
The Sustainable Hour.
For green, clean, sustainable Geelong. The Sustainable Hour.